So dear colleagues, friends, students, it's our honor to host at our institute for the second time Dr. Josiah Marineau. He's representing the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. He's Associate Professor of Political Science and also NKSA member, Midwest Political Science Association member. So we'll have today a very grateful, I think, a presentation concerning 2024 US presidential elections. Dr. Marineau will address the following issues: how US presidents are elected, what are the peculiarities of US presidential elections, introducing the candidates, Joseph Biden and Donald Trump, where things stand in the current election, and the implication of Biden or Trump victory for Armenia and for broader region, it means for the South Caucasus. Current situation in Georgia relating to the adoption by the parliament of the law regarding the so-called foreign agents law, and after we'll proceed with Q&A session, maybe for 20 or 30 minutes.
Sure.
Okay? Well, and I would ask you to keep silence, կխնդրեմ լռությունը պահպանեք, որովհետև տեսագրվում են։ So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So when I present, I like to stand. So if you don't mind, I'll stand. I like to move when I speak. But first, thank you all for coming to my presentation today. It's always an honor to be hosted by Dr. Ordukhanian. So thank you so much for letting me come and present at your wonderful institute. So what I'll be talking about for about 40 minutes is the current, as was said, the current election in the United States, and the candidates and what it means for Armenia. So I'll touch on these things. I do enjoy questions. If you have questions during the presentation, you're welcome to ask. It does not bother me to get questions. In fact, I might ask you all questions while I speak. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them at any point over the next 40 minutes or so. Okay, so I'll talk for a bit about what it means to become a US president and how elections are run. Elections in the United States are very long processes, and by the time we're done today, you'll know more about how presidents are elected than many Americans, so you can feel perhaps good about that. So what are the basic requirements? The requirements to become president are actually very minimal. There are only 3 requirements to run for the presidency. You have to be a natural-born U.S. citizen, so you have to be born in the U.S. or born to U.S. parents. You have to be 35, so it's actually the oldest age requirement in the Constitution. I guess the founders wanted the president to be kind of wiser and more worldly before getting into office. So that's the oldest age requirement. And then you have to be in the United States for 14 years. So you can leave the United States, but you have to be there for 14 years before becoming president. And that's it. Those are the only requirements. There are no requirements on experience. There are no requirements as to age limits or age maximums. You can be as old as you want and still become president. So despite it being very minimal with requirements, only 46 people have become US president in 230 years. So not many people actually achieved it, even though it's pretty minimal to become US president. Okay, so I'll give an overview of the election process in the states. So the first thing to keep in mind is it takes 2 years to run for the presidency. It's a long process running for the US presidency. When people run, it takes up their entire lives, and they don't have time for anything else. When someone's running for the presidency, they miss out on birthdays, funerals for family members. It takes up their entire lives. It's a very grueling, difficult process to run for the presidency. It takes at least 2 years. And we've been doing elections in the United States every 4 years since 1789, so for a long period of time. I believe these are the longest consecutive elections that we've held despite civil wars, despite world wars, despite even COVID. We've still managed to hold elections every 4 years. And I think that's the longest consecutive election cycle in the world. So there are 5 steps to becoming president, and I'll touch on each of them in some detail, but just briefly, first step is called the invisible primary. This would have been last year. The second step is where we are now, which is primaries and caucuses. This is about parties deciding upon a nominee. Then you have party conventions. We'll get to those in July and August. Then the general election, where we actually elect the president, and then the period after the election. We don't usually talk about this stage. We usually don't think about it, but nowadays it's actually increasingly important based on what happened a few years ago. So I'll touch on these in a little bit of detail before talking about the candidates. Okay, so the invisible primary. The invisible primary is the year before the elections are held. So for this election year, it would be January through December of last year. And this phrase, invisible primary, comes from a journalist by the name of Arthur Hadley. He wrote in the 1970s, and he calls it that unnoticed maneuvering, what a candidate does to help secure victory for himself. And so it's about all the people who want to run for the presidency. It's about them kind of trying to stand out and outcompete their competitors. So there are a few things that candidates are trying to get during the invisible primary. The first is media coverage. You want to get media coverage. And can you think why? Like, why would media coverage be important? Why would you try to get media coverage? Any ideas?
Media coverage before primaries?
Yeah, why is that important? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, why so?
Probably to get better
To
chances.
define
Yeah, exactly.
the electorate?
Yeah. Let's say again, actually.
To define the electorate?
Yeah, to define the electorate, to know the electorate, absolutely, yeah. So media coverage is really important for these reasons. It's like free advertising. In the United States, people don't really follow politics. People aren't like me. I love politics. Most people in the US don't love politics. And so it's hard as a politician for people to recognize you, for people to know you. So getting media coverage is helpful so that people know your name. And you can't get elected if people don't know your name. So name recognition, people knowing your name, is really important. Media coverage helps with that. Getting endorsements from other politicians, from other leaders in the country. Previous presidents, absolutely, yeah. That's helpful because it gives legitimacy. It makes you seem more serious as a candidate if other people endorse you. So that's one thing that people are trying to get in the invisible primary. And the last is money. Unfortunately, money is very important for US politics. Without money, you can't run. So to be an effective candidate, you need to raise a lot of money, like in the hundreds of millions of dollars. It takes a lot of money to run for the presidency. And the most effective politicians are often the best fundraisers. So for instance, Barack Obama, he won in 2008 partly because he was a very effective fundraiser. He could raise a lot of money. And other candidates like Kevin McCarthy on the Republican side, also a very good fundraiser. So if you do these three things, if you can get the media coverage, if you can get endorsements, if you can get money, you become known as the front runner. You're the person that's thought to be ahead of everyone else. If you're the front runner, you're more likely to do well in the next stage of primaries. So for the Republican side, there were at least six candidates in the invisible primary. You have these 5 people. Can anyone name them by chance?
Chris Christie.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, anyone out there?
Nikki Haley.
Nikki Haley.
I don't see the guy in front.
Yeah, that's Ron DeSantis. And then Vivek Ramaswamy and then Tim Scott. So those were other Republican candidates. And then obviously, who's that? Of course, yeah, Donald Trump, right? So obviously he was the front runner when this all began, right? He had all these things. He has money, he has endorsements, media, he has all of it. So Trump was the front runner, and sure enough, Trump did very well in the primaries and caucuses. So, but you want to become the front runner in this invisible primary. Okay, so then we get to the primaries themselves. These run from January to June. So we're actually in the primary season right now. This is our stage. The point of the primaries is to have the parties select a nominee. And you become the party nominee if you win enough states. States have delegates that you win if you do well in the election. And if you get enough delegates, if you get a majority, you become the party nominee. So this is ongoing. They're still holding elections now. 7 states and 3 territories haven't yet voted. In fact, today they're holding primary elections, I think in Kentucky and Oregon. So it's still ongoing, but we know the result. We know what's going to happen because 2 candidates, Trump and Biden, have secured a majority. So we already kind of know what the story is. But just in case you haven't seen them before, this is a primary election. It looks like a regular election. It's very quiet. You don't talk to people. It's a secret ballot when you go in and check a box, and that's that. A very different process is a caucus, which is like this. A caucus, you can talk to people. It's very democratic. You're trying to convince people to join your candidate's team. So it's a very different kind of process. They aren't very common, the caucuses, but I think they're really fascinating and they play an interesting role. So that's where we are right now. Okay, and then we get to the party conventions. So I think the Republicans will go first. They hold their convention in July. And Democrats will hold theirs in August. And this is where the candidate gets finalized as the party nominee. Nowadays, there's not a lot of drama in party conventions because the outcome is already known. Like, we know who the party nominee is going to be. So there's not a lot of drama or intrigue at the party conventions. Instead, they're very scripted. It's like a performance. People give speeches, they praise the nominee for being the best person ever, but we know what the outcome is, so there's not a lot of interest. Even me, I don't watch all of the convention. I'll watch the acceptance speech, but that's about it. It's not very exciting. That being said, I have some that are my favorite. So personally, my favorite party convention was in 1960 because the outcome was not known, and John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK, becomes the party nominee because of his maneuvering and deals and whatnot. So that for me is a really interesting convention. We don't do them like that anymore, unfortunately, but that's my favorite. My least favorite was in 2020 because of COVID. They were completely empty. There was no one in the convention space because of COVID restrictions. And so it was a very strange convention year. This year, hopefully, they'll be more normal compared to 2020. So what's the point of party conventions? Well, they officially introduce the general election. They sort of signal the start of the general election. And so they're interesting and they're important for that reason. So after the conventions, we have the general election. But they also can help give candidates a boost in the polls. So after several days of praising the candidate for being the greatest person ever, that can sometimes result in higher poll numbers. It's not clear if that's still true, but that's at least one of the goals for the conventions. All right, so after we have the conventions, so we finally get to the actual general election, where they are actively campaigning for the presidency. So the general election is actually quite short. It's only about, so it's September to November 5th. It's only about 65 days. That's not a lot of time. And so we'll talk briefly about strategy for running for the presidency. But the key thing to look for is the swing states. So in our system, for various reasons, some states almost always vote Democratic, and other states almost always vote Republican. But there's a small handful of states that can vote either way, and those are called swing states. The strategy for presidential campaigns is to target the swing states. Try to bring the swing state into your camp. We'll try to talk about how they do that. And this is important because one of the weird things about US presidential elections is the states actually elect the president, not the general public. And this can lead to some strange outcomes that we'll touch on in a second. And I'll explain more about how this works. But it's actually the states that elect the president, not the country as a whole. So it's a weird process. Okay, so how do you run for the presidency during the general election? Well, one of the main things that candidates still do is run advertisements, even on TV, for the few people that still watch TV. But of course online, on social media. So running for the presidency is very expensive, and this is actually one of the main reasons why. They're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on advertisements, both praising their candidate as well as dismissing the competition. So that's going to be a key thing that they do. Another strategy it's less common, but holding public events. Now, traditionally, presidents haven't really done that for a long time, like holding large public events. But one of the things that Trump does in 2016 and since is hold large public rallies. And these are one of the main features of his campaign, these large rallies. Joe Biden doesn't do that, for instance. Other candidates haven't really done that to the same extent. But for Trump, holding these large public rallies, he seems to really enjoy it and gets a lot of motivation from it. So that's one part of the running for the presidency. And they're expensive. You have to rent a facility, you have to hire security, you have to advertise for it. So it's expensive to do that. And then my favorite part of the presidential campaign is presidential debates. I've almost always loved these, because I enjoy seeing the candidates side by side. You can see how they interact. You can see their personality, for better or for worse. And I've always really enjoyed watching presidential debates. The past several debate cycles in 2016 and 2020 are not my personal favorite. They aren't quite as interesting. It's more about shouting and insulting and interrupting each other. So lately, they haven't been to my liking. But who knows, maybe they'll return to something more normal in the future. And it's also not clear how much presidential debates matter. It's not clear how much the average person really pays attention to the debates. But for people like me, of course I do, and I enjoy them. So we have the first one here in about a month. We'll have it in June 27th. And that's actually a little early. We don't usually hold presidential debates until October, September, maybe October. So they're holding them actually a little bit early this year. This is a strange year. for a number of reasons. It's definitely a different year in American politics. Okay, so, and of course we vote on November 5th, and then we usually know who the president is soon after. Okay, so a little bit about the strategy. So I'm sure like some folks may be familiar with this, but the way we elect presidents are through the Electoral College, and it's a different kind of system. And if you're curious, I'll tell you the history of it and why it's there and whatnot, but it's a strange system. So the way it works is each state has electoral votes, and if a candidate gets a majority in that state, they win all of the Electoral College votes from that state. And I'll show you a map of the Electoral College. So states have so many Electoral College votes, and there's a total of 538 Electoral College votes. So to win the presidency, you need to win 270 Electoral College votes. They call it getting to 270. And so there's different combinations of states that candidates are trying to win in order to get to 270 and deny their competitor 270 votes. The Electoral College is usually not very interesting. It's usually very quick. There's usually not a lot of drama around it. It looks like that. It's just people, it's usually in a state capital. Electors come together and they just check a ballot and then they go about their business. It's usually short. There's not a lot of interest usually in it. It's usually very kind of straightforward. This is a picture of the congressional aides. They're carrying, you kind of see a box. They're carrying in the Electoral College vote into Congress to officially certify it. So it's usually quick, usually not a lot of interest around it. But there can be some weird things that happen. One strange thing that can happen is a candidate can lose the popular vote, but still win the Electoral College. And that's happened about 4 times in US history, and happened twice in recent decades. So it happens first in 2000. This is actually the first election I paid attention to. This is George Bush versus Al Gore. And then more recently, Trump in 2016. In both cases, the candidate that won the Electoral College lost the popular vote. So it's a strange different way of doing a democracy, perhaps. Not many other countries have electoral colleges for this reason, actually. So that can happen. So this is a map of the electoral votes for each state. You can see some states are larger than others. So California is the largest with 55. Texas is second largest with 38. Florida and New York are tied for third, and then so on and so forth. So you can see why some states are sort of more important than others, right? If you're running for the presidency, it's more important to win Florida than to win like North Dakota, for instance, because Florida obviously has more electoral college votes. But the reason why you can lose the popular vote and win the Electoral College is because small states, like where I'm from Alaska, that's where I was born, has 3 Electoral College votes. Same with North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and some other states. There's a bias in the Electoral College towards states with small populations. So if you are voting in Alaska, your vote matters more mathematically than a voter in California or Texas. Because there's a bias in the Electoral College towards smaller states. And that's how you can get this losing the popular vote, but winning the Electoral College. Okay, then usually after the election, so we hold the election on November 5th, usually we know that day who the president is going to be. But in more recent years, it's become less clear. And so there's this 5th stage that I added. So we vote November 5th. We usually find out that day who the president is. It might be after midnight, but we usually know shortly thereafter. And then by December 17th, the Electoral College actually meets, and then they vote for who the person is that won that state. And then on January 6th, Congress counts the vote. Now again, this is usually a very boring stage. We don't usually pay attention to it, but 4 years ago, on January 6th, 2021, a day I will always remember. I was watching live, I was not there, but I was watching live when Congress was certifying the vote, and a riot broke out and took over the US Capitol. So you can see the pro-Trump protesters taking over the Capitol. And so it almost disrupted an election for the first time. Now, Congress still certified the vote, but it was a very uncertain day, very strange day. Hopefully we don't see that again, but who knows? Which is why I include the slide. And then on January 20th, 2025, the next president will be inaugurated, if everything goes well. So fingers crossed. Okay, so that's a lot about the presidential election cycle. Now you know more than most Americans about how it works. So who are these candidates? Well, again, a lot of you are probably should, you're all political science people, but so the first is, of course, Joe Biden, the current U.S. president. Joe Biden's an interesting person. He's been in office of some kind since the early 70s, longer than I've been alive. He was in the Senate for, I think, 4 decades. He actually ran for the presidency 2 times before 2020. He was a vice president under Barack Obama. So he's been around for a very long time. He's a career politician. That's a good thing. It's also not necessarily a good thing in the US right now. So he has some things going for him. He's running for re-election, obviously. Now, the first thing that's going for him is he's the current president. So in other words, most presidents, if they run for re-election, they usually win. Now, not always, but they often do. So running for re-election is often, you're already ahead compared to your competitors. He's also doing a very good job with fundraising. He's outraising the Trump campaign by about 2 to 1. They have around 160 million. The Trump campaign has about 80 million. So they're doing a good job with fundraising, and money is important, unfortunately, for US politics. So he has some things going for him. The problem, though, is he has a lot of things going against him right now. One of the main factors, and I talk to my students about this, they almost always mention this, people are very concerned about his age. Now, he's 81 years old, and that's getting pretty old, right, in most people's point of view. If you watch him move, he looks weak. If you listen to him speak, he doesn't sound very, firm. And people notice that, and people are concerned about that. If he wins re-election, he'll be 82 by the time he starts his next term, and so he'll be 86 if he serves out his full second term. And that's, what can you say? So people are concerned about his age. People are also concerned about the economy. Now, in some ways, the US economy is doing well. Unemployment is low. Economic growth is doing fairly well. The stock market is at an all-time high. So in some ways, the US economy seems strong. But a lot of average people, they aren't seeing that. It's not affecting them. Instead, they notice prices going up. So the price for eggs, price for gas, the price for food, and many other things, people see that going up. And their wages aren't keeping pace with inflation. So for the average person, they don't think the economy is doing very well. And who do they blame for that? Well, the president gets the blame. If the economy is doing well, the president gets the credit. If the economy is doing badly, the president gets the blame for it. That's how it goes. And even among people that like Joe Biden, they don't love him. There's not a lot of people who are, very enthusiastic about a second Biden presidency. Even people that will vote for him, they don't like the idea of voting for him. They will because they don't like the alternative. They don't like the Republican, but they don't love Joe Biden. So there's a lack of enthusiasm even among his supporters. And I'll show you where they stand in the polls right now. All right, so then we have his competitor. Of course, a person that I'm sure everyone here is very familiar with. So in Donald Trump, he's a really, he's very different from the typical presidential candidate, as again, I'm sure everyone here is aware. He's not a career politician. We haven't had a president who was not a politician for a long time. His background is, of course, in real estate. He made his money in real estate in the 70s and 80s. Kind of goes bankrupt in the 1990s, but then gets into reality television in the 2000s, and that restarts his career. So, of course, he's a former president. So, in other words, he knows how to win. He's done it before, so that's helpful. He's extremely well known. He's probably the most famous person in the country right now, for better or for worse. So a lot of people know who he is. And a lot of people who are his supporters are very enthusiastic. He has a base of supporters who just love Donald Trump, almost to like a religious extent, just about. So he has very enthusiastic supporters, unlike Joe Biden. But he also has things going against him. As again, I'm sure people are aware here. He's actually currently on trial in Manhattan for falsifying business records. And that's just one case. He has 3 other cases that are in different stages of proceeding. So it's so new. We've never had a former president run for a third time. So this is new. The idea of someone running for office while on trial for multiple cases, or at least multiple court cases, we don't know what that's going to mean if he wins. And then he also lost the popular vote twice. So even when he won in 2016, a majority of people voted for somebody else. So he's never had a majority of the country or the majority of voters supporting him. So he's never been able to get above 50%. Maybe that'll change this year, who knows? But that's going to be a challenge for Donald Trump. Okay, so this is where things stand right now in the Electoral College. So the blue states, of course, are states leaning towards Democrats. Red states are leaning towards the Republicans, leaning towards Trump. And if you add all that up, if you add all the blue states and their Electoral College counts, and the red states and all their Electoral College counts, Biden is around 226 in the Electoral College, while Trump is at 235. So right now, Trump's ahead in the Electoral College. Now you still have these 6 swing states. So you have 6 states that could go either way. You have Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. So these 6 states will determine the outcome of the election, which is strange if you think about it, But it's these 6 states. These are going to be the ones that really matter for who becomes president next year. And so where do the polls stand for those 6 states? Trump's ahead in 5 of the 6 swing states. So Biden's ahead in Wisconsin. He's ahead 47 to 45. Well, this was a poll that came out. This is a New York Times poll. It came out last week. So Biden's ahead, but by a very small margin. He's ahead 47 to 45. That's not very big. It's a pretty small margin, about as small as you can get, just about. And in the other 5 states, Trump is ahead. And in some of these states, he's ahead by a very wide margin. So like in Nevada, he's ahead 50 to 38. Nevada, for a while, I thought was going to be a Democratic state. Like I think Nevada voted for Barack Obama in like 2012, I believe. But now it looks like it's leaning Republican. Georgia, ahead by a large margin, 49 to 39. Arizona, Michigan, 49 to 42. Pennsylvania is a little closer, but still, Trump is, as of right now, in my opinion, Trump is winning the election. So if the Biden campaign wants to change that, they have a lot of work to do over the next several months. So who knows? Who knows what will happen in the polls? Okay, so that's a bit about where things stand. Okay, so what is this all going to mean for Armenia? So this is a little speculative, but you can look at their current policies and Trump's former policies. So will this all matter for Armenia? Well, if Biden wins, we're likely to see a continuation of current U.S. policies towards Armenia and also the broader region. So one of the goals that U.S. administrations have had for several decades is regional stability, both within territories like Georgia and also between countries like Azerbaijan and Armenia. Armenia. So promoting regional stability, trying to help resolve through diplomacy issues that might erupt into outright conflict. The Biden administration has prioritized democracy and democracy promotion in Armenia and also in Georgia. So the U.S. government's perspective of the events in 2018, the U.S. government sees those events as a peaceful transition of power. The U.S. government supports the Velvet Revolution. It also sees the 2021 parliamentary elections as progress towards democracy. And so the U.S. government wants to see those kinds of trends continue and deepen. So the U.S. supports things like rule of law, anti-corruption measures, transparency, and accountability. So promoting democracy is one of the U.S. government's policies towards Armenia. And then also supporting market reform. So again, supporting rule of law, trying to limit corruption, and promotes the investment climate in Armenia for U.S. investment and for other international investors. So, but also I think the general orientation of Biden's foreign policy will also be important for the region and the broader world. So the Biden administration's foreign policy has been largely in line with foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy, since 1945. In other words, supporting what they call the rules-based international order. So supporting a U.S. that's engaged in international affairs, a U.S. that's promoting democracy, promoting capitalism.
Interventionism.
What's that?
Interventionism.
Intervention, absolutely, yeah, when necessary, absolutely. And supporting institutions like NATO. So NATO, under the Biden administration, NATO is seen as an important tool for maintaining the rules-based international order. That's likely to be maintained. Along with this, the Biden foreign policy has been much more multilateral. You can call it, there's any political or international relations students, you can call it a liberal internationalist foreign policy. So looking to collaborate with allies in Europe and elsewhere on common challenges, where the U.S. is leading or helping to lead, but collaborating and cooperating with other allies instead of dictating to them or only asserting our interests. And where this all comes together in terms of the foreign policy issues for today is support for Ukraine. So Ukraine has received tens of billions of dollars of U.S. Military assistance and economic assistance. And that will be maintained most likely in a second Biden administration. Now, how Congress will change, that's a whole other question. But support for Ukraine is one particular regional policy that's relevant that will be maintained under a Biden administration. Under a Trump administration, of course, it had different priorities, both for Armenia, the region, and the broader world. So policies towards Armenia under a Trump administration will likely resemble its policies towards the region that it had in 2016 to 2020. So the Trump administration had a very harsh policy towards Iran and wanted to they had this phrase of maximum economic pressure. So trying to really squeeze the government of Iran economically and wanting other countries to participate in that, countries that border Iran, of course, like Armenia. And so I think that would put Armenia in a kind of difficult position. Of course, Armenia gets along with the Iranian government. And so Armenia might be in a difficult position if those policies become center to U.S. perspectives on the region. The Trump administration was not particularly interested in democracy promotion, so that won't be one of the main focuses of U.S. foreign policy on Armenia if Trump comes back. Instead, I would expect defense cooperation to be, again, more centered to U.S.-Armenian relations. So the Trump administration tried to increase defense cooperation with Armenia. It sounds like some of those policies weren't successful, but I would expect that to become more of the focus, both on Armenia and Georgia and other countries in the region, if Trump comes back into office. And also just thinking about the broader foreign policy orientation, I think is also relevant for Armenia and how it thinks about the West and the U.S. So the foreign policy under the Trump administration was known by this phrase of America first, the view of this is that people in the United States, they think that the United States is giving away too much money, we are too invested in the rest of the world, and so we need to focus on our problems at home. So people in the US, like my students, when they hear about the US giving tens of billions of dollars to Ukraine, they say, why are we doing that? We have problems here. We have bridges collapsing. We have road systems. We have so many problems. We have debt. Why are we giving money to other countries? And Trump's foreign policy, for some people, it really resonates. Some people really believe that this is how US foreign policy should be conducted. So I think we'll return to this America First foreign policy. I think it'll be more effective, which I'll talk about if you're interested. But what it looked like is a transactional approach to international relations. So in other words, it's not based on values. For Trump, he doesn't really care about democracy or human rights or these principles that inform US foreign policy. Instead, it's more of like, what's in it for us? What can we get out of this relationship? It's more pragmatic, it's more transactional, very personalist. He has this, I think for this reason, he tends to not get along well with our Democratic allies. And if anything, he had the hardest relations with traditional US allies, like in Europe, for instance, or even in Japan. And instead, Trump seems to get along better with autocrats. He famously admires Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and other kind of autocratic leaders. So I think that's going to become another aspect of US foreign policy, which I think will be relevant for Armenia as it goes on its democratic journey. And in particular, this all comes together in this last point. Trump has made it sound like he's much less likely to support Ukraine militarily. The United States has been one of the main supporters of Ukraine's defense. And so if the US cuts that off, that's going to have a very important impact on Ukraine and also more generally for the rules-based international order. It very well could be the case that under a Trump administration, again, this is speculation, but the US could even pull out of NATO under a Trump administration. So who knows? And if that happens, that's going to have a very important impact on the West and the rules-based international order. What's that?
On the whole world.
Absolutely, absolutely. It would have a very drastic impact. So who knows? Who knows what will happen? But that's at least, I think, reasonable speculation based on his policies last time and the kinds of things he talks about. Okay, so I will stop there. And thank you so much. I look forward to your comments and questions.